Hi everyone, welcome. As you can see here on the label, I've got the abbreviation ENC written on this. And this is one of my tubs of European night crawlers. And like I do sometimes, I've got this bin matched up with another bin, sort of buddy bins. And the other bin is a few weeks younger. So this is the older of the two, and as we usually do, we're usually starting out with the older bin and then moving on to feeding the younger bin. And 12 days have passed since we last checked in on these two systems and fed them. So they seemed to be due based on just the passage of time. So I anticipated the need for food and brought some down from the refrigerator. The stuff I feed my worms is usually frozen. So they're getting an interesting variety of stuff here. As you can see on the bottom here, well, it's not frozen anymore because the stuff's been out here at room temperature for perhaps an hour and a half now. There's strawberry, banana peels, and in this bag, protecting me from the stench, is a whole bunch of mushrooms. In this bag over here, I'm very interested in giving this bag a try in the worm bin. It sort of seemed like a plastic bag, but it had this very fine, sort of silky feel to it, and it says that it's okay to compost it. It says that it's compostable and it's okay to compost it in your backyard composting setup. So I'm not in my backyard, I'm in my basement. And whether that backyard composting refers to the hot composting, which I'm assuming it does, I'm questioning now whether or not it'll break down without reaching that 130 or whatever degrees a hot composting situation reaches in the backyard composting scenario. So I figured we'd give that stuff a try in the worm bin. If it gets eaten, that's awesome. It'll be an interesting little oddity, something I've never tried before, trying to compost a compostable bag. It's just that I'm not certain about, exactly what type of composting they're referring to when they talk about the backyard composting. I think it is fair to assume that they're talking about a type of composting that includes a great deal of heat. And, well, if without the heat it just sits in the worm bin and never goes anywhere, then we could always pull it out. But we're going to give it a try. And I figured I would only do it in one of the bins. We're going to do it in the second bin, So I'll empty the half of the mushrooms into this bin when we feed. And then I'll hang on to the I'll hang on to the bag and include it with the feeding of the second container. So now we're starting into the bin here. Very nice. Large collection of castings all over the top surface here. All very nice and fluffy and soft. Here and there you see some leaves, the stems of leaves. And I've got a box full of leaves over here on the side. I was thinking maybe we could even do something I haven't done in a while, which is to include sort of a top covering of leafy material. Kind of give the whole thing a little natural appearance. So why don't we just proceed right down into the feeding zone and see how things look in here. I've got all that top covering newspaper scraps that we just removed bit by bit. Doesn't seem like that newspaper is in any shape to continue on as a top covering, so I sort of anticipated that that might be the case, and I already crafted a replacement for it. And I didn't really see one in here, but that too might have already just gotten nibbled away. I might have had a feeding zone indicator, and a lot of my bins having a feeding zone indicator showing where we last fed is tradition. So I've got a nice replacement here. Whether there was one here or not, I don't know. But in addition to that variety of kitchen scraps, they're also going to get some coffee, and each system will get a feeding zone indicator. Here we've got the stem of a pumpkin with some worms hanging out on it. Some of the worms even look like they're possibly, I don't know, they really seem to like getting into the little nooks and crannies of that thing. And as we start making our way down into the feeding area, I think we're already starting to bump into some of the stuff they got last time. I'm pretty sure we had frozen potato bits, and it was It was with the peel on it, and the peel is what appears to remain here. All the yummy potato looks like it was nibbled away, but the basic thin peel, the little bit of leftovers of that remain. Not a whole lot though, and I think I'm seeing banana peels here too, so I'm assuming banana was also one of the things we fed in the last check-in. This corn cob though, this corn cob would go back quite a ways. I mean, we're in March now, so we're well through the halfway point of winter in my region, and corn in my region is definitely a summer produce, or food, whatever. So there's been no corn around here for some time. Any leftovers of corn in any of my systems has to go back many, many months. The only thing I'm really after when I'm picking through here is I'd really like to see some of this leftover bedding material sort of dislodged from itself if it's clumped up the way it is here, and just spread around into the neighboring material so that it all has a good chance at getting broken down. Now this pumpkin stem, I could see a few worms that have actually made their way down through the thing here too, down into the middle of it, and the whole thing is really mushy and squishy and soft. I don't want to break it, but I bet if we did, we'd probably see a number of worms hanging out on the inside of it. This is more banana peel, and that's the actual stem of it. And I guess other than little bits of confetti size shredded paper and perhaps a few chunks of leftover bits of food, there doesn't seem to be much remaining of the last feeding. So 12 days seems like it was a pretty good interval to come back in here to feed these guys again. So let's actually excavate properly now. Make a little bit of space so we could drop today's feeding in. Here again, I'm just sort of probing for anything that seems to be clumped together so that I can really quickly dislodge it from whatever it's attached to and sort of break it apart. Here too, it looks like another chunk or two of potato peel. Here too, the potato peel seems like it was kind of stacked up on itself, and that might be the reason there's still little bits of leftover potato on the peel. Otherwise, I'm sure the worms would have nibbled it all off by now, because that just seems to be the case when you find a leftover piece of potato peel. But I only find that after I've frozen it. In a lot of my systems, I've gone ahead and fed the potato peel without freezing it, and then months and months later, it seems like the stuff is still crunchy and fresh, like you could probably still eat it. So I've learned that if I want to see the potato actually get eaten, it helps tremendously to first freeze it, and then as it thaws, it gets mushy and the worms can actually eat it, versus it needing to, on its own, get to a point where the breakdown process permits the worms to start feeding on it. So there is a good bit of leftover bedding material in here, but I figured as long as I was going to go grab my box of leaves anyway and use the leaves as sort of a nice top coating out on the bin, perhaps we could use the leaves as a bedding for the feeding. Here is an example of a piece of potato peel which did not get frozen and probably has been in here for a couple months now. And I was able to snap it in half because it is still kind of crunchy and crisp, as is this piece right here. So I've already gone through that in a number of my bins recently, seeing how bits of potato just last and last and last. And a lot of times they even begin to grow within the worm bin, with a nice rich medium to be in and moisture and everything else. Sometimes they actually begin sprouting and trying to grow within the worm bin. And they're super persistent, so it takes quite a long time for it to finally get to the point where it begins breaking down, where the worms could nibble away at it. So let's go ahead and fetch some leaves. I've got a pretty good supply. My box was recently reloaded, and I think I've only tapped into it one time to feed one other pair of systems a few days ago. Otherwise, it's almost entirely full box of leaves. So that's a pretty good, generous quantity over there of bedding material. So let's proceed with dropping in their food. A lot of times I'll sprinkle the coffee in on top, but I don't want to become too much of a creature of habit, even though I definitely am one anyway. But I figured just for a little variety's sake, why don't we start by sprinkling in the coffee down here low, in with the leaves, setting aside the filter to be our feeding zone indicator at the end. Now, one thing I also like to include with the coffee, just so it doesn't end up sitting there as like a big mound of uneaten stuff, is a little bit of worm chow, which I've really found to work well to get the worms over there and start nibbling on it. And it seems like I've seen no leftovers of coffee ever when I sort of spice it up this way a little bit with some worm chow, so that's kind of become my routine. And you know, before I forget, is all this nice additional bedding material. So in addition to the recycled papers from the top coverings, as well as all those nice leaves on the bottom, I think we've provided these little guys with a nice abundance of bedding materials, onto which we can start in with some of these kitchen scraps. So we'll start out with the banana peel, and you know, that reminds me, we've got a bunch of leftovers we need to submerge down into the feeding area too, so let's not forget about that. Let's do that now before I space out and forget. So a couple stems of pumpkin, leftover cob of corn, a few stems, and a little bit of banana peel remaining from the last session 12 days ago. But other than that, not a whole lot as far as leftovers go. Alrighty, and now we could come in with, well, this is the part that concerns me a little bit, because if you ever smelled mushrooms beginning to go bad, you'll know it's not a pleasant odor. So I'd prefer to keep it in the bag if I'm not actually feeding it. So now, let's see here. This is kind of a combination of some mushrooms that my mom donated to the cause here, as well as some that I found in my own refrigerator that needed to be disposed of because it was too far gone. And hey, look at that, there's even a blackberry in here mixed in with the strawberry bits. And what's this? Apple peel. This too came from my mom, so I wasn't quite sure what to expect. I just saw strawberry when I looked at the little bag that it was placed into, and I thought that that's all it was, but it seems like there's a few other yummy things in here as well. Before we close up this feeding zone, I'm going to sprinkle in a little bit of this pulverized eggshell to serve as grit for this feeding. And now with the bedding and the food and the grit, I believe we're at that point where we can start covering up the feeding zone now. Very nice. The moisture levels in here, I don't know, pretty good so far. I'm curious what we're going to find in the other bin. And I'm also curious to see how things on the outreaches of both of these bins are too. So before we close up shop, we're going to excavate down into the outer edges too to see how things look. And there's clearly a lot of worms hanging out in this material. I see virtually nothing other than castings surrounding them. So they seem perfectly content to be hanging out in their finished castings over here. Maybe there's some organic material out there still kind of breaking down gradually and providing them with something to chew on. So I mean, here's too like a banana stem, which is really getting worked down. That was part of what I just extracted out of that outer edge. So I would imagine that those outer edges do usually have some varied leftovers floating around in them. Here too, some leftover potato peels that go way back. You can even hear it crunch when I broke it. And that's got to go back a couple months at this point. So I think unless there's some real unusual circumstance that leads me to putting potato into my bins without freezing it first, I believe that I'll be pretty much freezing all potato before it goes into my worm bins. Otherwise it'll just sit there. So now out here on this edge, we'll just do a quick till up and aeration. So besides checking to see how the moisture is holding out, I do like to see that it's full of worms, telling me that it's in good shape for you know, worms to be in. Otherwise they wouldn't be there, I believe. And from a moisture perspective, it looks great. There again, if it wasn't, I don't think we'd see quite as many worms over in it. So this system looks really good. Coming along so nicely. Alright. Now before we start covering up here, we're going to put a top coating of leaves out here, and then we'll put the feeding zone indicator on, I think. I don't want to put too much of this stuff out here. I just figured a little dusting just to give the whole thing a nice sort of natural appearance. Spread it out somewhat evenly. And then we could proceed with covering the system up and bringing out the younger one. The younger ones, I believe, only maybe 2.5 or 3 weeks younger, or maybe a little bit more, maybe 3.5 weeks younger than this one. So there's not a vast age difference between these two systems. They both have European night crawlers in them, and I believe they both got launched with worms that originated from the same system. So even though they got different launch dates and different ages, I'm fairly certain that they have the same lineage as far as the same parent bin. Alright. I like to be pretty thorough because then the moisture starts to recirculate underneath the plastic everywhere, making it a really comfortable place for the worms to hang out. And then by putting this out here too, I provide nice darkness because, you know, the daylight can shine through that translucent material, perhaps preventing worms from wanting to hang out there. I like to keep it dark and cozy for them. Alright, let's go get the younger bin and get them fed. Alright, so I mean, like I said, not the same age, but ever since this one was launched, I'm fairly certain it's been buddied up with the other system, so it's probably been maintained in almost identical ways as the other system. And for that reason, I generally expect to see very similar things. We'll probably see some old crunchy potato peels that were placed in here raw. I guess one thing we didn't really spot in the other one was any mating worms, but here you can see two worms that are latched together. It almost looks like somebody tied a knot and connected them together. But that's what the worms do when they're mating. They sort of latch onto one another, and I see another one right here. Another pair of mating worms. Oops, sorry guys. I shouldn't be so disruptive. I should just leave them be. Although, I guess with all the excavation that's going to be happening here, they're going to get disturbed one way or the other. And it'll probably interfere with that process that they're in the middle of right now. So it's just something I regret having to do. And I guess I don't have to be so intrusive, but I'm just a curious type and I can't seem to resist. So this is just the way I feed my bins. Very interactive, very hands-on. It looks like we've got a few springtails making themselves at home in here too. So let's just follow suit with what we did. We excavated the feeding zone, tried to see how the leftovers are coming along. But with the leftover bits of shredded paper and cardboard bedding that was placed in here, we are trying to sort of break it apart, loosen it up a little bit, and blend it with the surrounding materials so that it all has a good opportunity to break down. So we're going to do the same here. Here again, we're starting to see little bits of potato peel, pretty much stripped down to the peel where there's no real potato remaining on it. That's the stem of a banana. I'm assuming here too we'll probably bump into the stem of a pumpkin like we did in the other one, because usually when I feed one bin the stem of a pumpkin, I feed both. And this looks like a piece of corn cob, and this to me actually does seem like a little tiny fragment of, here it goes, another couple pieces of it. These are all fragments of the same pumpkin stem, but it's really falling apart at this point. Kind of makes me question how much longer we're going to be able to continue identifying it as a pumpkin stem. I do remember when that pumpkin stem shattered into multiple pieces, and I always attempted to try to keep those bits near each other. So I'll probably keep doing that if I can. That's another piece of corn cob. Those little pieces of corn cob are small that way because I did actually begin in the very beginning of the summer last year cutting up the corn cobs into these little discs. Pum, 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 little small pieces of corn cob, which I thought would help accelerate the breakdown process. And as you could see, the worms are working on it. But they're not broken down yet, and it's very fragile. If I wanted to, I could certainly just give it a little squeeze and it would shatter into little tiny pieces. But I'm just a curious type, so I prefer to keep things like that intact and let nature take its course so we can observe its breakdown over time. And sometimes even with those larger corn cobs that I didn't slice up into little pieces. Ooh, emergency vehicles. I'm not sure if you could hear that. So, yeah, when I take the entire corn cob, sometimes it seems like the whole thing just shrinks. The whole diameter of it just shrinks. It's like it's collapsing in on itself gradually as the worms work it. And so far, I don't think I've really bumped into any pieces of old potato peel, but then again, we are going a little bit more quickly here. It's usually the first bin. Here's some banana peel. I'll usually handle the first system's feeding as sort of the familiarization of what's going on in both bins. So I'll take a little bit more time there, but by the time I get to the subsequent bins feeding, I usually feel like I'm good to go in terms of kind of picking up the pace and just getting the feeding taken care of without being so exploratory and curious. Alrighty. And now we can proceed with putting in the feeding, but remember, we're going to do something a little bit different here. We're going to be including that bag that the mushrooms came in. I don't know where my mom got that. That was the bag that my mom gave me those mushrooms in. So I'm not sure where she got it, but it's so weird, just the way it feels. It's got this really very lightweight, thin sort of texture to it. I think I might have even mentioned how it feels almost silky and smooth. So it's just a little bit unusual. And here too, we're just going to follow suit with my sort of trick for getting the worms to work the coffee down, which is to dress it up a bit here with the worm chow. And once again, we're going to return these old scraps back down into the feeding area. And there's not a whole lot of it, but I guess when it comes to this stem, or these fragments of stem, at this point it's 4 separate fragments, I do like to try to keep them near each other so that hopefully in the future check-ins we bump into them and get a chance to see how they're coming along. But now we can proceed to the addition of the foods that we bought down here for them today, most of which seems like it's thawed out for the most part. It still has, you know, a little bit of frostiness to it and coolness to it, but it's probably been a good couple hours now since I bought this stuff down here. A lot of times I'll bring everything down here, the camera's all set to go, the food is sitting there, I'm all ready to film, but then I tell myself, hey, you're not going to be able to get started there until you take care of something that needs to be done, some sort of housekeeping sort of work. So today the housekeeping I forced myself to do before proceeding to the feeding of the worms was processing down an old pumpkin that I had. So I collected a whole bunch of pumpkins after the Halloween season last year. And over time I've been gradually, oh, let's not forget, the star of the show. So I've been gradually working down these pumpkins, providing me with a really abundant supply of pumpkin. I always chop it up into little tiny pieces and then freeze it. So I was actually able to come up with maybe, I think, 9 bags worth of chopped up pumpkin bits. And I would say each one was probably close to a pound in weight, so it was a good sized pumpkin. Alright, so I am starting to smell the funky stink of mushroom, spoiled mushroom. And I think we were pretty fair, divvying out the foods to both systems. I mean, 1 banana peel for each system, that was easy enough to divvy up fairly, but the mushrooms and everything else had to be sort of divvied out evenly. And I guess, you know, I don't like the idea of an unfortunate worm ending up inside this thing and not being able to get out. So my idea was to, you know, we're going to proceed with the whole trial of trying to compost this compostable bag here. But I'm going to put a little knot on the end of it just so it doesn't have like an opening into which an unfortunate worm could wander by chance and end up in there and then unable to come out, and then possibly lead that to an unfortunate end. So I just figured, why don't we place this compostable bag in just like so, and perhaps by doing it this way, if in the end it's going to become a problem, it's not going to be difficult to extract it and do away with it, and it's also not going to become like a death trap for worms to wander into and then meet their demise in there because they can't get out. Here's a piece of the old potato peel crunchy bit, so I thought we weren't going to encounter any of that, but we just did. And like we did before, just really quick, oh, I just saw a cocoon there. Not too surprising, the fact that we bumped into 2 mating pairs there in the beginning. Not too surprising that there's cocoons floating around in here. Look at that, so many worms over here too. Although in this material I'm definitely sensing something other than just castings. I think I feel a lot of residual bedding and leaves, and I think I see a lot of leaf stems too. So it does seem like we must have applied a pretty generous portion of leaves into this system as bedding at some point recently. Some of which is still lingering here as leftovers. Not too surprising that the worms are really enjoying that space to hang out in. Because, you know, even though we're giving them nice fresh kitchen scraps, right down the middle, all those leaves and all that moisture out there is just as welcoming and comfortable for them to hang out in. So I'm not too surprised. Alright, here too another chunk of potato peel. Still crunchy, still almost fresh, but thank goodness not growing. And even out here, a lot of worms hanging out, enjoying the space. Nice bedding mixture, nice moisture level. Everything's in great shape. Okay, that's just one of my things that I've been trying to do recently, is take the extra time there to make sure that all parts of the bin get tilled up and aerated nicely. And at the same time, it also gives us a quick peek into how things are working in there, you know, to make sure everything's got the moisture level it needs, make sure it's got worms hanging out in it, which in itself is a pretty good sign of things being in great shape. So now I get to find what I forgot to add. Here I am, trying so hard to be careful not to forget anything, and I'm just the, I guess, space cadet who always manages to forget something. But that was a quick little recovery. We just placed it in there. into the feeding area, where hopefully it'll serve a good purpose. Now, what did we do? We placed the feeding zone indicator on top of the sprinkled in leaf covering, so we'll do the same here in the interest of consistency, and then we'll be finished. Stuff like this, I usually pick sticks like this out. They just get sucked up into my leaf collection with my leaf vacuum. But if it were to sit in here, it would just end up, becoming litter in the finished compost when the system comes to its end, because something like that's just not going to break down anytime soon, or at least not in the amount of time that my typical worm bins are in service. So, back on go the coverings. Not only the plastic covering for moisture retention, but also the shade cover newspaper at the very end. And now we're finished. And guess what? We talked about replacing the top coverings underneath the feeding zone indicators, and here they are, the pieces that I had fashioned for that exact purpose. And I forgot. So, I guess it wouldn't be me if I wasn't forgetting stuff all the time. Alright everyone, that's it for today. I'm not going to be excavating, opening things up just to put those on. They're just going to have to do without. So, we're done here. I got a few things I got to take care of putting away and cleaning up. I'm not going to keep you around for that. That stuff's boring. Before I go there really quick, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up if you enjoyed the video. Hopefully you did. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's also very much appreciated. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.